King Kong vs. Godzilla, the original from the 1960s. This movie is wild. It basically, I saw in a Letterboxd review that described this movie as sitting on the borderline between absurd and plausible. And considering what the movie was going for, yeah, I might not be far off on both of those points. But for more on that, here is my good friend and Life in the Movies podcast co-host, Jacob Martin. Jacob, take it away.
Thank you, Ryan, for having me on your channel once again. It's a privilege to talk about Godzilla versus Kong. Wait a minute. Got the two mixed up. That's the Hollywood version that came out in 2021. No, this is King Kong versus Godzilla is what we're talking about on your big epic Godzilla project in the run-up to the new Godzilla King Kong crossover coming out, I'd like to say in March 2024. Godzilla X Kong, the New Empire, or something like that. Looks like a fun movie. I've actually never seen the original King Kong vs. Godzilla. This is actually the third film in the Toho Godzilla franchise following Godzilla and Godzilla Raids Again. I've actually seen both of those movies before, so it was good to actually see the continuation of those movies, even though I was not that big a fan of Godzilla Raids Again. The first Godzilla film is excellent. And this film pretty much is the first crossover film between Godzilla and King Kong. It's the first time you see the two legendary monsters on screen together. Also the first time you see them in color for the first time, and also in widescreen. So some really cool features with that. This movie, I can't say this movie's anything spectacular or anything. It's one of those movies where you pretty much, you know what you're getting into when you realize the title of the film, King Kong versus Godzilla. You're not expecting like high art or anything. There's not really that many memorable... Like with the American films, the human characters are nothing to write home about in this movie. They're just kind of there to get the story set up, and the monsters getting to do their destruction and carnage, pretty much. I don't think these characters do anything unbelievably stupid in this movie compared to like some of the recent Hollywood films, but then again, you have... Part of the plot of this movie on the King Kong side involves a TV producer trying to get these people to go to the island to get King Kong so King Kong can be on TV. Now, how dumb is that? That's a disaster waiting to happen. So, yeah, I guess there is a little bit of stupidity in some of the characters, but not really as bad as some of the recent, MonsterVerse films that Hollywood's been making the last few years. Yep, I think if you are one that doesn't really like old school effects, you're probably going to look at this movie and think it's like a cheaply made movie, because it's obvious that Godzilla and King Kong in this movie are like people in costume. And then there's also stuff in this movie where you can tell that there's model tanks and model trucks and model planes during some of the destruction sequences. And you know what? As someone who's a sucker for some of these type of effects, I actually thought there was a charm to that. I enjoyed seeing those effects at work, and I had fun seeing the destruction and carnage on screen. I think there's imaginative spirit when Toho makes the Godzilla movies, which can also be just as fun as even in the Hollywood films where you have the bigger budgets and the CGI and stuff like that, where the characters look more, I guess, realistic in the newer films. I still like the charm in these older films and seeing how they pulled some of this stuff off back in the day. Although I can see some people say that It's cheap looking, but you know what? I do like the effects in this movie for what they are. The movie starts off as a standard monster film because you have they kind of redo the King Kong movie where characters go to the island and King Kong does his thing and they capture him, but then he escapes, kind of like in the 1933 film from America, and then Godzilla comes out of hibernation and does his thing, and they're not really together. They tease it at one part of the movie, probably about the hour mark. But then when you get to like the last 10, 15 minutes, that's when Godzilla and King Kong actually fight. I think they build it up well, but I do think there are some lulls in the story to where it's like some of the carnage, even though it's fun, they do stretch it out too thin. A part of me is like, come on, let's get past the fluff. I want to see the two titans fight. That's called King Kong versus Godzilla for a reason. When you do see the fight, it is a lot of fun. Yeah, it is cheesy. Again, with some of the effects and some of the cuts and the edits and stuff like that. It's like, yeah, you can tell it was made in 1962. There is some cheesy stuff. There are some unintentionally hilarious stuff. That, me and my sister were laughing our heads off. Like, there's this funny part with King Kong shoving a tree down Godzilla's throat, and Godzilla's just going, it's kind of funny to watch, but I enjoyed it for what it was. I'm a sucker for seeing these, seeing these two monster movies where you have the two titans fight. Let them fight, like Ken Watanabe loves to say in the Godzilla film from 2014. It's still a good watch. I do like in this movie, I will say, one aspect I do prefer in this film over the Hollywood version, Godzilla vs. Kong. There is a winner in this movie. There was no winner in Godzilla vs. Kong. They kind of left it as a draw in that movie. I do like that there is a winner in this film. And I think I do have to respect that because, when you have a big fight, you have to have a victor. And that's what King Kong vs. Godzilla does. And I think on that account, that's a little bit more satisfying, the way they did it in this movie. So I have to give Toho credit for that, at least. The movie around the fight is nothing too special. There are some good sequences of carnage and stuff, but like I said, the characters aren't really nothing to write home about. There's a few lulls in the story. It does drag out at times, but I think the movie is still worth watching, especially to see Godzilla and Kong on screen together for the first time. There's good individual sequences with both characters, and then, like I said, when they do fight, the movie is worth watching for that alone. So, if you're a big monster movie fan, yeah, this is definitely worth the watch. I'm giving the film a 3.5 out of 5. Really solid movie. If you haven't seen it already, definitely give it a watch, especially before the new film comes out. You see how they did stuff back then in the 60s compared to now. It'd be fun seeing the compare and contrast. I enjoyed this film for what it was. Thank you, Ryan, for having me on your channel once again. I'm sure you'll leave links in the description below, but I've pretty much been on your channel for a good while now. I think most of you guys know who I am. I'm even the co-host on the Life in the Movies podcast over on his channel. Ryan, I can't wait to hear your thoughts on King Kong versus Godzilla, where it stacks in your Godzilla ranking, and I guess your King Kong ranking as well. Hope you enjoyed this film as well, buddy, and back to you.
Jacob's channel, as always, is linked in the description. Go give him a subscribe there. As for King Kong versus Godzilla, the making of this movie is honestly more interesting in certain respects than the movie itself. To make a long story short, this was a years-long odyssey to get this movie off of the ground. Toho and Universal wanted to, well, make this movie for quite a while. So much so that the initial draft of this movie didn't even have King Kong in it. It was originally supposed to be Godzilla versus Frankenstein, or Frankenstein's monster. Basically, to make a long story short, Dr. Frankenstein would have been hired, I guess, to create a Godzilla-sized Frankenstein's monster. Don't know how I would have felt about that. And don't get me wrong, I love the original Frankenstein and the Bride of Frankenstein, but I just don't think that that would have worked. It's like it just seems so weird. And a running title for the movie with the Frankenstein monster still in it was called Godzilla versus Prometheus. Yes, really. But through a long and winding tale, it eventually landed on King Kong versus Godzilla, the ultimate monster mash. This was directed once again by Ishiro Honda, who directed Godzilla Raids Again and the original Godzilla. He came up with the basic structure of the movie because of how he felt television was corrupting the millions. He even referenced he even referenced two elderly women in Japan dying while watching a particularly violent pro wrestling match. Ah, the 60s. There was even a sentiment that television was like rotting people's brains. There was a Japanese journalist that said television was creating 100 million idiots. This journalist would not be around for the rise of social media, but that's neither here nor there. To make a long story very short, there is a solid backbone of this movie with in regards to subplot, or not subplots, but themes. The movie tries to go for this whole idea that television is just used to sell you stuff and is just used as a vehicle to sell you things rather than actually telling stories. And while in 2023, with channels like HBO still going pretty strong in the story department, there is a lot of that rings pretty true. So much so that the main villain of the movie is a guy who runs a pharmaceutical company and wants to create this Godzilla versus King Kong match to get big TV ratings. So yeah, there was a lot more going on underneath the surface of this movie than just a massive gorilla fighting a massive dinosaur. I don't particularly think the subplots and the subtext works most of the time, but I admire the commitment to doing more than just the have two monsters fight each other, because there are a lot of movies that just do the bare minimum and just do that. But they don't do that here, and I weirdly appreciated that. The reason why you would ever watch a movie like this is the Godzilla versus Kong fight, which is pretty epic. There are some dated parts, but the movie came out in 1962, so it's going to be expected, and CGI was not a thing. It's two guys in rubber suits going like this, but it's low-key pretty epic. Basically, there is a lot of fun things that happen here. Godzilla shoves a tree down King Kong's throat. Kong throws Godzilla around by his tail. There's the infamous scene that James Rolfe pointed out where the two look like hand puppets. I caught it. It was very funny. Ultimately leading to Godzilla and Kong crashing into the sea. There was also rumors, and James Rolfe talked about this, of the infamous double ending, where in one part of the world Godzilla would have won, and in the other part of the world Kong would have won. Turns out that ending was not true in the slightest, and it was never even created. You would honestly think, though, I mean, Godzilla versus Kong, like nowadays, the 2021 version is already like well done and like it's now a thing, but it would have been amazing if like in Japan Godzilla would have won and like say here in the US Kong would have won. But what do I know? So is this movie dated in places? Yes. Does it overstay its welcome in the subtext and the subplot department? Yes. But when the fight gets going and it actually happens, it's epic. I give it a massive recommendation.